I was 22 years old the summer Silas Rourke rode into Ash Hollow, and I'd tell you I knew right off what he was, except that would be a lie old men tell to make themselves sound wiser than they were. What I knew was that a stranger had stopped his horse at the Calder gate at dusk, that Faith Calder was standing in that gate with her late husband's shotgun and her chin up, and that 4 of Colonel Ash's riders were sitting their horses 20 yards back with a torch already lit. I was mending harness in the barn, and I heard the whole thing. "You've got until Sunday, Mrs. Calder," the lead rider called out, a broad man named Purdy who did the colonel's uglier work. "Sign the water rights over, take the colonel's fair price, and nobody's got to lose a barn over it." "I buried my husband on this land," Faith said. "I'm not signing it away to bury my children's future too." Purdy laughed low and mean and nodded at the torch. That's when the stranger spoke. He hadn't said one word since he'd stopped his horse, and none of us, not Purdy's men, not Faith, not me watching through a crack in the barn boards, had paid him much mind. One more dusty rider on a dustier road. "That's a lot of men," he said, "for one woman and a shotgun." Purdy turned in his saddle. "This ain't your business, stranger." "No," Silas agreed. "But I've got nowhere particular to be tonight, and I find I don't care for the smell of kerosene." Nobody moved for a long moment. Faith didn't lower the shotgun and didn't look at him either, kept her eyes hard on Purdy, like she'd learned already that a woman who looked away first lost more than the argument. I found out later that was exactly the kind of thing she'd learned. One bad season and one worse winter at a time, in the 2 years since they'd put her husband in the ground. Purdy waited. 4 men against 1, but the stranger sat his horse like a man who'd done this kind of arithmetic before and come out ahead more often than not. And there's a stillness some men carry that tells you plainer than a drawn gun what they're capable of. Purdy had seen that stillness before, I'd guess, and didn't like what it had cost him the last time. "Colonel'll hear about this," Purdy said, "which is what men say when they mean I'm leaving." They left. The torch went out somewhere down the road, and I never did hear how. Silas Rourke didn't come to the porch after they'd gone. He sat his horse a moment longer, touched his hat to Faith Calder, and made to ride on toward town like he'd just happened to pass through the middle of something and didn't feel it was his to finish. "You could water your horse first," Faith said, "since you're already caught up in my business." That was as close as she came to a thank you, and it was enough. He stayed the night in the barn, where I was still pretending to mend harness I'd finished an hour before, too curious to go in to supper. I learned his story slow, the way you learn anything from a man who's decided talking about himself is a debt he doesn't want to owe. He'd been a lawman once up in the Dakota country, and there'd been a fire there too, a range war he'd tried to stand between, and a family that hadn't made it out of a burning house because he'd been called away to handle a smaller trouble first. He carried that. He carried it the way some men carry a limp, not talking about it, but you'd see him go still sometimes at the smell of wood smoke, even good wood smoke, a cookfire smoke, and you'd know where his mind had gone. He'd sworn off badges and range wars both. Told me once, out by the corral, that he'd meant to ride clean through Kansas territory to nowhere in particular, a man with no fight left in him to spend on other people's troubles. "Then why'd you stop?" I asked him. He was quiet so long I thought he wouldn't answer. "Man doesn't always get to choose which fights find him," he said finally, "only what he does once they have." He stayed on as hired help that first week, mending fence, breaking a green colt Faith's late husband had never gotten around to, doing quiet work that didn't ask questions of anybody. Faith watched him the way she watched everything since her husband died, careful, weighing, unwilling to hand trust to a man just because he'd been useful once. She had 2 young ones to think of, her sister's orphaned boy and girl she'd taken in the year before, Daniel who was 11 and solemn, and Ruth who was 7 and not solemn at all. And Faith Calder had learned the hard way that kindness could wear a friendly face and still cost you everything. "You don't have to stay," she told him, the third or fourth evening when he'd fixed a hinge nobody asked him to fix. Purdy's not likely to try that again soon. He'll try again, Silas said. Man like Ash doesn't quit because one night went sideways. He'll come back with more men and less patience. That's not an answer to what I said. No, he agreed, it isn't. She let it lie there between them, unresolved, and went back inside. But I noticed she left the barn lantern burning that night, where she hadn't before, like maybe some small part of her wanted him to know the door wasn't locked against him even if her words hadn't opened it. Colonel Ash was building a spur line to the railhead, and Willow Creek ran straight through the middle of every small holding he needed to buy up cheap or take by other means. He'd already broken 2 families that spring. The Petersons had sold under threat and moved on, and the Whitfield place had burned clean to the foundation with nobody ever proven to have struck the match, though everybody in Ash Hollow knew whose match it was. Faith Calder was the last holdout on the creek, and everybody knew that too. She wasn't foolish about it. I heard her tell Silas, one evening on the porch while Daniel and Ruth chased fireflies in the last light, that she'd have sold 2 years back if it had only been about money. It was never about the money for me either, she said. This is where Ethan's buried. This is where I promised him I'd raise these children right, on land that was his family's before it was mine. I don't know how to be the kind of woman who signs that away because a colonel's got more men than I do. You're not that kind of woman, Silas said. I've been here a week and I already know that much. And what kind of man are you, she asked, that keeps mending fences on a place that isn't his, for a fight that isn't his? He didn't answer for a while. Then, the kind that's tired of watching good people lose what's theirs to men who never built anything themselves. She looked at him a long moment in the dusk. That's not the whole answer. No, he admitted, but it's the part I'm willing to give you tonight. She almost smiled at that. I saw it, the corner of her mouth, quick and gone. It was the first time I'd seen anything in her face since her husband died that wasn't just grit and worry stacked on more grit. Ruth took to him faster than Faith did, the way children will read a man's heart before their elders trust their own eyes to do it. She started following him to the corral in the mornings, chattering about nothing, and he let her, patient in a way that surprised me from a man who moved through the rest of his days like something coiled and waiting. You had children? I asked him once, careful, because I'd heard enough of his Dakota story to guess at the shape of the rest. A daughter, he said. She'd be near Ruth's age now if things had gone different. He didn't say more, and I didn't ask more, but I understood something then about why he'd stopped his horse at that gate instead of riding on past it. Some debts a man pays forward because he can't pay them back to the one he owes. Daniel was harder to win over, old enough to remember his own father, old enough to be wary of any man who might be measured against that memory and found wanting, or worse, found adequate, which felt to an 11-year-old boy like a kind of betrayal of the man who was gone. Silas never pushed it. He worked alongside Daniel without making a project of him, showed him how to read a horse's ears without making a lesson of it, and let the boy come around in his own season, which he eventually did, the way boys do when a man proves patient longer than the boy's suspicion holds out. By the second week, Faith had stopped asking him when he meant to move on. Ash sent Purdy back with a paper the following Sunday, an offer dressed up as generous that was really just theft with a signature line. Faith read it on the porch steps with her children close and Silas standing a little back, present but not crowding her decision. Same answer as before, she said, and handed it back unsigned. Purdy's smile had gone thin. Colonel's patience is spent, Mrs. Calder. There won't be a third asking. There wasn't a first one either, Faith said. Just men with torches pretending they were being reasonable. Purdy's eyes cut to Silas. You do well to ride on, stranger, before this gets to be more than you bargained for. I bargained for exactly this, Silas said, quiet. The day I decided to stay. Purdy left with the paper still unsigned, and this time nobody pretended it was over. I won't pretend to you now that what followed was some grand battle, the kind you'd hear sung about. It wasn't. It was 6 days of a woman and her hired hands, myself included, and old Coot Abernathy from the next spread over, who'd lost his own creek rights to Ash the year before and had a grudge he was glad to lend. 6 days of watching the road, sleeping in shifts, moving the horses to the back pasture where a fire couldn't trap them, and one gunslinger who barely slept at all. Walking the fence line at all hours like a man, standing sentry over something he'd already decided was worth more to him than his own rest. Faith brought him coffee near midnight on the 5th night. I watched from the barn loft, the way a young man watches things he doesn't yet have words for. "You don't have to do this," she said again, the same words as before, though I think by then they both knew what she really meant by them had changed. "I know," he said. "Then why?" He looked at her a long moment, and when he spoke it was the most words I'd heard him say together since he'd arrived. "Because I watched a family burn once and told myself after that I'd never again stand somewhere I could stop it and choose not to. And because you're not the kind of woman who needs saving," Faith called her, "and I've come to admire that more than I know how to say plain, but you shouldn't have to hold this line alone just because you're capable of it." Capable and alone aren't the same as should have to. She was quiet a long moment. Ethan used to say something like that. That being strong enough to carry a thing doesn't mean you're meant to carry it by yourself. Sounds like he was a wise man. He was. She looked out at the dark fields. "I loved him a long time and I don't know how to stop grieving him just because." She stopped. "You don't have to stop," Silas said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" "Nothing tonight," he said. "Tonight I'm just standing this fence." She left the coffee with him and went back inside. But she stood in the doorway a moment first, looking back at him standing there in the dark like a man who'd already decided some things about his own heart and was waiting, patient as he was with the horses, for her to decide the rest in her own time. Ash's men came the 7th night, and they came in force, Purdy and 8 others, torches and rifles both, meaning to finish what threats hadn't. I was 17, the truth of how scared a man can be and still stand his post, and I learned it that night in the Calder yard. Silas stepped out from the shadow of the barn before they'd cleared the tree line good, and something in the way he moved, unhurried, certain, a man who'd done this kind of arithmetic and made his peace with every number in it, made Purdy's whole line slow before they'd meant to. "That's far enough," Silas said. "There's 9 of us," Purdy said, though his voice had lost some of its Sunday certainty. "There is," Silas agreed. "And there's a woman and 2 children in that house who have done nothing but hold onto what's theirs. And there's you, about to burn it down on a colonel's say-so for wages that won't buy back what it costs you to do it. Get out of the way." "No," Silas said, and it wasn't loud, but it filled that whole yard like a bell. "What happened next I've told 100 times over the years, and I'll tell it to you straight and undecorated, because the truth of it is better than anything I could dress it up to be. There was no massacre." Silas put a shot through Purdy's torch hand before Purdy had finished raising it, close enough to sting and far enough to spare the bone, and in the scramble and the shouting that followed, Coot and I put 2 more shots over their heads that said plainer than words, "This line is held." And it was Faith Calder herself who stepped onto that porch with her husband's shotgun raised steady, and said the thing that finally turned them. "Tell Colonel Ash that everyone in this territory will know by morning that he sends men to burn women out of their homes. Tell him I said his railroad can find another way around, or it can go through a graveyard of his own reputation instead." They rode off ragged and short, one working torch, and Purdy nursing a hand that would heal crooked but heal, and I don't believe Colonel Ash ever sent another man up that road again. Word does travel in a territory that's small, and a colonel with railroad money still needs the goodwill of a territory he means to keep doing business in. Faith's warning proved truer than any of us, even her, quite expected. It was near dawn before the yard settled, and the children could be coaxed from where Faith had hidden them in the root cellar. And it was full light before Silas finally sat down on the porch steps, the fight gone out of his shoulders all at once the way it does in a man who's been carrying more than he lets show. Faith sat down beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Ruth came and curled up against Silas's side without asking permission of anybody, and he put his arm around her the way I imagine he might once have held a little girl of his own, and something in his face that night was different than anything I'd seen in it before. Not the stillness, not the coiled waiting, but something closer to rest. "You could have been killed," Faith said finally. "I know the risk I took," he said. "I took it anyway." "Why?" He looked at her, and this time he didn't reach for the smaller answer he'd given her before. "Because somewhere along this last month I stopped being a man passing through your life," Faith called her, "and started being a man who couldn't imagine leaving it. I don't know when that happened exactly. I only know it did." She was quiet a long moment, and I thought, young and foolish as I was, watching from the barn door where I had no business lingering, I thought maybe I'd overstepped hearing it and turned to go. Her voice stopped me. "I buried one good man already," she said. "I don't know how to open that door again, without being afraid of what it costs to lose someone twice." "I can't promise you it won't cost you something someday," Silas said. "Nobody living can promise that. All I can promise is I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to, and even then I expect I'd argue." That got the smallest laugh out of her, tired and real. "I'm not telling you to go." "Then I suppose that settles it," he said, and it was as close to a proposal as either of them managed that morning, though it would be near a year before there was a proper wedding in the Ash Hollow church, with the whole creek's remaining families in attendance, and Daniel standing up beside Silas looking prouder than any boy I'd seen, and Ruth strewing wildflowers she'd picked herself with more enthusiasm than order. I stayed on at the Calder place, the Rourke place, I suppose it became, though Faith kept her first husband's name on the land deed out of respect for the children's father, and Silas never once asked her to change that. I worked that spread another 11 years before I struck out for my own patch of ground, and I watched, in that time, a family finish building itself out of grief and grit, and one gunslinger's decision to stop passing through. Colonel Ash's railroad went around, in the end, same as Faith had told him it would. The Whitfields never did get their place back, and I think that loss stayed with Silas the rest of his days, a debt he couldn't repay no matter how many fences he mended after. But Willow Creek kept running through Calder land the way it always had, and the barn Purdy's torch never got to light still stood the last I saw of it, weathered and solid, the way some things are built to last simply because somebody decided, on one particular dark night, that they were worth standing a line for. I asked Silas once, years on, whether he regretted stopping that evening instead of riding through like he'd meant to. "Not for one day of it," he said. "A man doesn't always get to choose which fights find him, but I got lucky enough that the one that found me was worth staying for." That's the whole of it as near as I can tell it true, not a grand story. Just a woman who wouldn't sign away what was hers, and a man who finally stopped running from the kind of trouble worth standing in, and a home that got built out of both.